Hello, everybody. I'm really glad you guys could make it out. This is part of our Normalizing Dissent tour where we're going around the country speaking about ex-Muslim issues, raising awareness. We've been in New York before. This is the second time in New York. Hopefully, as we move forward, we'll continue to do these around the country. If you're interested in having ex-Muslims, let your friends know. We're happy to come to both. We're doing them in Canada and in the United States. A bit about us. This event is put together by Ex-Muslim North America. We're a nonprofit that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of ex-Muslims to make apostasy more mainstream. There's a huge stigma among Muslims about leaving the faith, and we're trying to erase that stigma, making it normal. People should have the freedom of conscience to believe whatever they want, live their lives however they want, and we're aiming to change that. We have a variety of programs related to that. We're organizing support communities around the country. We're active in about 20-25 cities. We're doing a series of videos called Life Beyond Faith. You can look at us up on YouTube. And those are sort of expounding on the variety of experiences ex-Muslims have. Some people, their families are very accepting and they don't encounter any real resistance. They're happy, they move on. For some people, it's much more traumatic. People have been kidnapped. People have had to go into hiding. So we want to highlight the diversity of experiences people have and sort of humanize ex-Muslims. We are in every family. If you're a Muslim family, the chances are within your immediate family, if not immediate family, extended family, there is one of us around. So that needs to be more accepted. So that's why we're doing the Life Beyond Faith series and we're doing these Normalizing Dissent. Ultimately, we're your family, we're your brothers and sisters, we're your parents, we're your children. And it needs to be okay where being ex-Muslim is mainstream. And we're rapidly getting there, surprisingly faster than I had anticipated. So today we're talking about specifically that topic, about the rise of ex-Muslims and how hopefully this will lead us towards an enlightenment within the Muslim world. And we are marching towards that. By the way, my name is Muhammad Syed. I am the president of Ex-Muslims North America. I have Ali Rizvi with me, who is the author of The Atheist Muslim. And Ibn Warraq, who I would say is the foremost author about topics related to ex-Muslims. He's written more books than I can count. His first book from that I encountered was Why I'm Not a Muslim, which goes into details about the arguments against Islam. If you haven't read it, I highly, highly recommend that book. So Ali, why don't you start us today?
Okay, well, everyone, thank you for having me here. Thank you for coming here. And it's really good to see so many of you came to an event like this. I think it's great. Thank you, Muhammad. So a few years ago, I was on this website called Twitter, which is a famous forum for presidential communications, I think, here in the US. And someone had, so what I do is I'm a vocal critic of Islam, and there were people having conversations about this, and I think someone said something critical about Islam. And then somebody else responded, and I was watching this, and this other person said, don't say that, that's racist. It's really racist, you're being, criticizing, saying these things about Islam. So the first guy came back, he said, well, no, it's not racist, because Islam isn't a race. And he's right, Islam isn't a race. Nobody's born with a hijab sewn to their head. Nobody's really born pre-circumcised or anything. But so I responded to that as a joke because I was in a light mood, and I said, but Islam is a race, because first you hear a loud bang, then everyone starts running. And pretty much all hell broke loose. And people started just bombarding me. It's like, how could you say that? How could you joke about bombs and there are people dying and so on? And I was just thinking, don't do that. We talk about Christianity, we joke about Judaism, we joke about Mormonism. There's the Book of Mormon, whole Broadway play that's been out for a long time, getting great reviews. If you're a lapsed Catholic, people praise you as a brave person. If you are an ex-Hasidic, you get a Netflix documentary out of it. If you're an ex-Scientologist, you get a book deal and you get a TV series out of it. But when you criticize Islam, and somehow you're a traitor, you're a sellout, you're a house Muslim, you are a native informant, and all these different terms for people who've left Islam. So that's bigotry. That is what is bigotry, when you hold that to a different standard. And All of us, I identify as a liberal. As a liberal living in the West, we are all products. Like people who are liberals are all products of the age of Enlightenment. All of our freedoms, all of the liberties, all of the secular pluralism that we enjoy today are the result of scientists and philosophers who were brave enough, a couple of centuries ago, to challenge the religious orthodoxies and the theocracies of the Dark Ages in Europe. So, as beneficiaries of their actions, of these free thinkers' actions, it's really short-sighted for us to dismiss all of the activists and the dissidents and the reformers in the Muslim world who are also challenging their religion to gain the same benefits for their societies. Right? If we hold them to a different standard, then we hold the activists and the thinkers who helped us get the world that we live in today in the West, we're being hypocrites. So one of the things I'm really glad this event is framed around the Enlightenment, and I actually want to start talking about framing this movement as a movement for the Muslim Enlightenment. And we have talked to ex-Muslims of North America. The ex-Muslim movement has grown in a way that I couldn't imagine. I started doing this about 10 years ago, and there were just a few names that one of them was Ibn Warraq, who was a hero to me. I mean, I read his book, Why I'm Not a Muslim, when I was young, and it was hugely inspiring. And then there were people like Maryam Namazi, who started the Council of Ex-Muslims of Britain in 2007. There was Ayan Hirsi Ali, who had written Infidel, and even before that, she was a very vocal ex-Muslim. So there were just a handful of people. There was Salman Rushdie. There were a few. There was a handful of people who were speaking about this openly. And today, when I see what has become, we're having events like this. I have my book out. We have podcasts. We have XMNA doing a university tour. There are all these amazing organizations, and there's a huge community internationally of, just official out members, like people who actually speak out, of tens of thousands of people at least. And the people who are underground are probably massively, the number is probably massively higher than that. So I think we're at a point right now where we can acknowledge the ex-Muslim aspect, the part of our history that led us to where we are, but also start looking to the future. And here are some of my arguments for why I think talking about this as a Muslim Enlightenment is a good way to go. First of all, it's about past versus future. So we've talked about our ex-Muslim experiences. We have the stories, we have these the videos that Muhammad is talking about online, and those are an essential key component of it. But we also want to talk about what we're going to do from here, where we're going to go. Whether that means public activism, whether it means writing more books, whether it means getting into the arts and entertainment, or whether it means having more conferences and more dialogues like this. All those things. We want to move from a dialogue of fear and persecution to a dialogue of hope and inspiration. And that's one thing that I think that the word enlightenment encompasses very well. The second important thing is it's happening. This idea, people say, you're overplaying it. There's no real Muslim enlightenment happening. The first place I would ask you to look is I'd ask you to look at the leaders of Muslim countries. Saudi Arabia in 2014 labeled atheism as a terrorist offense. So atheism is now terrorism in Saudi Arabia. There are TV channels in the Middle East that are warning of a, quote, tsunami of atheism. These are Islamic clerics who are saying this on TV, and they've used those words. In Malaysia, in response to the local chapter of, there's a group called Atheist Republic. They organize in Malaysia, which is a Muslim majority country. It's run by my friend Armin Navabi. The government vowed to hunt down atheists. This is open persecution of atheism happening in Malaysia. And these are policies that they're drafting. Those are just some of the examples. You see in Iran, you look at Saudi Arabia, you look at Pakistan. In Bangladesh, they're targeting, the public is really, really scared of writers, people who are just blogging. They're scared of them, and they're cracking down on them. So these things are real, they're happening. If you look at the response to the governments and how they're cracking down on it, you might think, oh, that's terrible, that's not a good thing. How is it a good thing? Well, think about what they're reacting to. Why are they doing it? They're reacting because there is something happening that is a threat to them. Right? That is a symptom of what I think, right? And I think it's quite apparent that is the roots of a genuine enlightenment in the Muslim world. You also see it in polls. There was a Gallup poll from 2012 that looked at religiosity across the world. It wasn't about ex-Muslims or atheism or anything specifically, but they found out that in Saudi Arabia, this is the birthplace of Islam, the Quran, and Muhammad. In Saudi Arabia, 19% of people identified as non-religious. By comparison, it was 15% in Italy. Okay? They also found that 5% of people in Saudi Arabia identified as confirmed atheists. Not non-religious, not agnostic, just confirmed atheists, 5%. Out of a country of 26 million, that is well over 1 million people. Well over 1 million atheists in Saudi Arabia alone. And we have every reason to think that these numbers are underreported. So that's another thing. There are headlines all over the world right now. I saw an article about you guys in the BBC. I just want to take a minute to read out some of them, because usually I show this on a PowerPoint, but Losing Their Religion, the Hidden Crisis of Faith Among Britain's Young Muslims. This is from The Guardian. These are mainstream organizations. The Dilemma Facing Ex-Muslims in Trump's America. This is from The Atlantic. Invisible Atheists, The Spread of Disbelief in the Arab World by Ahmed Benchemsi. This is in The New Republic. How ISIS Drives Muslim from Islam by Thomas Friedman in The New York Times. BBC, Ex-Muslims, They Left Islam and Now Tour the US to Talk About It. That's the XMNA article. And Slate has also done a great piece on you guys. The Economist, The Number of Ex-Muslims in America is Rising. India's Ex-Muslims, Shedding Traditional Islam for Science, from First Post. Conversions from Islam in Europe and Beyond by Faisal Devji. This is also from the New York Times. The Young Turks Rejecting Islam. This is about an exodus from Islam. This is from May 2018, again in the BBC. So these are just some of the headlines that are happening about this. So this is a real phenomenon. The next reason for framing this movement as an enlightenment is that I think it's a great way to reach liberals. Okay, so one of the things that many of us have heard about the regressive left, and we might even get into that in the discussion today, but I found, I was recently in the Netherlands and Belgium for the Dutch release of my book, and this really resonated with a lot of liberal audiences there. When I talked about this, what I'm talking to you about today, I would say, when you did it, just a couple of centuries ago, you called it the Enlightenment. When the Christian world did it, and when a lot of white people did it, you called it the Enlightenment. When we're doing it, you're calling it Islamophobia. That's bigotry. And I found that was a really powerful message that resonated. And even if people didn't completely agree with it, it's something that made them think. And I think that's great. For liberals, this is a great analog. And this brings me to the last point, is that it distinguishes it from reform. So when we talk about reform, and I'm aligned with a lot of people who are working for Muslim reform, I prefer what we're doing to that by far, because I think that when we talk about reform or we talk about reformation, what we're doing is there's an analog in people's minds that makes them think of John Calvin, Martin Luther, all of the stuff that happened with Christianity and the Protestant movement. And that is not the kind of analog that I want people to think of when they think of reform in the Muslim world. I want them to think of the Enlightenment. I want them to think of progressive thinkers who actually fought for secularism and who fought for civil liberties. And that's and for liberty and liberty of speech, free speech and free expression. And those are the Enlightenment values that liberalism is founded on. So I think that it creates a much better analog. It triggers a much better association that is friendly to liberal audiences. And I also think that just Enlightenment, the term, embraces everything that we're trying to do. I mean, there's nothing in it that contradicts anything that we're trying to do. I also have I have a podcast that I do with Armin. It's called Secular Jihadists for a Muslim Enlightenment. Our most recent episode is with Steven Pinker, who wrote the book Enlightenment Now, so it was a great fit for him to come on the podcast. I think Sarah Haider's been on it as well, and Muhammad will be on there soon. I really feel that the message is resonating, and we had a great conversation with Steven Pinker about it too. Finally, how do we talk about this, and how do we do this? How do we challenge and criticize Islam and have this conversation without characterizing all Muslims as representing the worst of the religion? And this is a big challenge, especially in like the way that the political situation is right now, not only here but around the world. Many of our family friends, many of our family are friends. The audience that we want to reach, that we want to talk to, lest we become an echo chamber ourselves, we want to reach out to other Muslims. We want to reach out to younger Muslims. When I was young and I was, a believing Muslim sort of teetering on the edge, today's the first time I've ever met Ibn Warraq, but Ibn Warraq reached out to me. He didn't know he reached out to me, but I read his book and he reached out to me. I wanted that message. I don't know if you thought at that time that, when you're writing this book, I'm just saying it, I don't know if you thought it would reach some, 19-year-old kid in Karachi, but it did. So there's I was older. I shouldn't have admitted that. Okay. Yeah, I wasn't just 19, I think I was a little older. So these things do matter. The fact that, we're having conversations like this, we're having them openly, that there is diversity among our views. I mean, not all of us think, I know Muhammad and I and Ibn Warraq probably disagree on many things as well, but I think we're aligned in one goal, that we want to have this discourse, we want to have this conversation, we want to have it in a place where we're not threatened by death, we're not threatened by persecution, we're not threatened by disownment or ostracization or marginalization from our communities and from the society as a whole. And thank you. I'm looking forward to getting into this.
To add one comment to that, it's not just about us being able to do it without violence. We want to do this everywhere. Hopefully someday we will. Okay, we can ask them, if you give us a second, to up the volume. There are mics set up and there are speakers set up. Could you ask them to, yeah.
So just speak louder for now.
Yeah. So we need to have these conversations everywhere in the world, not just in America. We need to have them in Pakistan, where there is the death penalty today. That needs to be repealed to the point where we can have these conversations. In the Middle East, even in Saudi Arabia, I'm an optimist. That's why I'm doing this to begin with. And I hope that within my lifetime, we will get to that point where in Saudi Arabia, maybe even in Makkah, we're having conversations about atheism where people are leaving the faith, and it's okay to talk about it. It's okay to be whoever you are, wherever you are. So the original author that started a lot of this, Ibn Warraq, if you want to start.
Oh, okay. I wrote my first book, Why I'm Not a Muslim, in around about 1992. I sent it into my publisher, Prometheus Books, in 1993. And the reason I wrote it was...
Can I speak up? I think you just go in the front, just stand up.
Yeah. Okay.
Right, guys, we're going to go old school.
Let's see. I hope this will be a little bit better. Okay, I was in contact with a group of secular humanists based in Buffalo, and I was subscribing to their magazine, Free Inquiry, and they were having a series of articles from people who had left their faith. So it was the structure was why I am not blank, and why I'm not a Mormon, why I'm not a Catholic, and so on. And they couldn't find anyone to do one for why I'm not a Muslim. So they heard about me, it's a long story. Finally, they asked me to do it, so I wrote the article in 1992 for the magazine Free Inquiry, and I then asked them whether they would be interested in a full-length book on the whole subject, because the man who founded the secular humanists also founded Prometheus Books, Dr. Paul Kurtz, and they were delighted at the idea, and they took it up. I sent the book in 1993, but because of their rigid structure, because they have to announce the book at least 6 months before in a catalog and so on, it didn't actually appear until 1995. It was as I said in the preface, it was my war effort. It was my contribution to what was going on in Iran and the Rushdie affair. Salman Rushdie was, had a fatwa thrown at him in 1989, and I really felt personally threatened somehow, and I realized that I had acquired various what Rizvi could call Enlightenment values, and I was really shocked that there were so many intellectuals, instead of defending Rushdie, were attacking him. They were blaming the victim. People like Sir Lord Dacre, Hugh Trevor Roper, the historian, the writer John le Carré, and so on, and even Germaine Greer. So there were exceptions now. Dear friend Christopher Hitchens, of course, he was a great friend of Rushdie's, and he defended him. But I was nonetheless shocked by the lack of solidarity with Rushdie. It didn't help matters that Rushdie was seen as somebody really arrogant and so on, which was really irrelevant. It's kind of anyway. So you asked me whether you realized that your book would have this kind of influence. Well, at the beginning, I used to get very heartwarming letters, especially from women, saying that you were defending our rights in the many from North Africa, from Morocco, Algeria, and Egypt. And recently I met a Moroccan lady called Zineb al-Razawi. She was the survivor of the Charlie Hebdo massacre. She just didn't happen to be in the office that particular day. And she wrote a book recently, which I'm hoping to get published. She wrote it in French. I translated it. I hope we can get it published. Anyway, she was saying that Why I'm Not a Muslim was, in fact, a underground classic for her generation. They were downloading it. Somebody had translated it into Arabic. Incidentally, if you have a copy, I'd love. I've never seen the Arabic copy. It's been translated into 10 languages, but unofficially, I think it's been translated into Arabic and Urdu. But if you have any copies of that, let me know. But on another note, I was. Okay. Can I sit down now? I was at a conference in about 2007. I can't remember, 6, 7, in Buffalo, and it's okay.
Yeah.
And I was in between. I think the keynote speaker was Richard Dawkins, and I was going towards the main hall where he was speaking, when two vaguely Asian-looking men, and 3 in fact, came up to me and said, "Are you Ibn Warraq?" And I said, "Oh my God, this is it." But in fact, it turned out they wanted to say, "You changed our lives. And we wanted to thank you." So I mean, what writer could ask for anything better compliment than being told that you had changed their lives for the better? I hope, anyway. So the Enlightenment, after my first book, I was pushed into somehow continuing writing on Islam, on my main focus was, for reasons that will become clear in a second, on Quranic criticism, because I felt that, and this was confirmed, I didn't know this at the time, I only read him more recently, about 8 years ago. I read the magnificent trilogy by Jonathan Israel on the Radical Enlightenment, the Enlightenment Contested, and the Democratic Enlightenment. 3 huge books, each is about 800, 900 pages. And he, excuse me, he pushes the Enlightenment much further back. Normally we begin in the 18th century, and you know, the usual suspects are rolled out, you know, Voltaire and Rousseau and Montesquieu and Condorcet and so on. But Jonathan Israel makes this very startling claim, which it had an enormous impact on me and gave me a lot of encouragement, because I like my 2 colleagues, I feel that reform is the wrong word. We don't want what I call dishonest tinkering. We need an enlightenment, not just dishonest tinkering with the text here and there. I'll give you an example. I don't know, I think his name is Ahmed Ali. He translated the Quran fairly recently, and his idea of reform is to reinterpret various passages in the Quran. The one famous one, I think, is Surah 4, I can't remember, 4, on men having the right to beat women. The verb is daraba. The Arabic word is daraba, and it's been interpreted, if you look it up in the Lisan al-Arab or any of the other dictionaries, it says to beat, to scourge, as it's translated by Marmaduke Pickthall. But Ahmed Ali says, no, it doesn't really mean that. It means to have sexual intercourse with. So you mustn't beat them, but just have sexual intercourse with them. I mean, come on. I mean, I've heard of hitting on women, but this is pushing it a bit too far. Anyway, what we need is an enlightenment. So both the Renaissance and the Reformation were incomplete. So now I'm quoting Jonathan Israel. By contrast, says Israel, by contrast, the Enlightenment, European and global, not only attacked and severed the roots of traditional European culture in the sacred, magic, kingship, and hierarchy, secularizing all institutions and ideas, but intellectually and to a degree in practice, effectively demolished all legitimation of monarchy, aristocracy, women's subordination to man, ecclesiastical authority, slavery, and replacing these with the principles of universality, equality, and democracy. But what brought this about? Spinoza and Spinozism were in fact the intellectual backbone of the European radical enlightenment everywhere, not only in the Netherlands, Germany, France, Italy, and Scandinavia, but also Britain and Ireland. And the work that accomplished this was Spinoza's Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, published clandestinely, but nonetheless courageously by a Dutch publisher in 1670. Back to Jonathan Israel, Spinoza offers an elaborate theory of what religion is and how and why religion construes the world as it does, creating a new science of contextual Bible criticism, analyzing usage and intended meanings and extrapolating from context, using reason as an analytical tool, but not expecting to find philosophical truth embedded in scriptural concepts. End of quote. So this is me now speaking in this article I wrote, in his attack on the very possibility of miracles.
That was Allah.
Okay.
Or a virtuous position to be sitting.
In effect, Spinoza denounces clerical authority and so on and so on. So this was Spinoza's launching biblical criticism. But in fact, it's a bit unfair because biblical criticism started long before Spinoza in 1670. I won't go into the history, but there's a lovely. I'm researching a book, and there's some lovely, lovely discoveries that you won't believe. It's on atheism in classical Islam, and one of the things that I learned was that Spinoza. Now remember, if Israel is correct, Spinoza is the man who single-handedly brings about the Enlightenment and the secularization of Europe. He was very probably influenced by the Quranic criticism of Ibn Hazm. Nice irony there. He died in 1067, Ibn Hazm. Anyway, that's another story. But we need something like biblical criticism in the world of Islam. In other words, Quranic criticism. This has been made really difficult for all sorts of reasons. I don't know why at some stage around about the First World War, Western criticism, Western academic study of the Quran lost its rigor, and they allowed all sorts of incredible things that they wouldn't allow when discussing the Bible. Their methodology was far looser. The Islamologists were far more credulous. It was amazing how unrigorous their methodology was. And of course, in more recent years, you have the corrupting influence of Saudi, Libyan money. Saudi Arabia has given more than $237 million in the last 12 years to Western universities. And and of course you have money from Iran, you have money from Libya, and also of course China and so on. But this money comes with strings attached. Dennis McEwen lost his job at the University of Newcastle because he was teaching Islam in a way that the Saudis didn't approve of. So there is this reluctance to apply the same kind of methodology that had been applied to biblical criticism since at least the 17th century. And this was one of the reasons why I and a group of German scholars got together. This was following on a conference organized by this secular humanist organization I was working for in 2007. The Christian part was organized by Professor Joe Hoffman, who was a leading scholar in the study of the historical Jesus, and he was responsible for the historical Jesus project. And he's an amazing scholar, has a great company. The triumphalists, Islamic triumphalists among you might be pleased to know I'm told he has converted to Islam since then. Anyway, and Joe Hoffman left me the section on Quranic criticism. So I invited a group of German scholars, and they went back home and said, this is great, we should continue this. And they formed a group now known as the Inara. Inara was our translation of the word enlightenment into Arabic. So Inara Group has been going since 2007, and we've had about 5 or 6, I've lost count now, 5 or 6 conferences applying rigorous analysis to various aspects of the Quran and the early history of Islam, which had been neglected by the mainstream Islamologists. And we've published at least 7 volumes of the research, and gradually this has been discussed, it's been accepted. We are no longer considered completely on the fringe and crazy. We had a conference just this year in March in Germany, where we had amazing people that would have shunned us about 10 years ago. People like Professor Gerald Horting, who was at the School of Oriental and African Studies, Carlos Segovia from Spain, Guillaume D from Belgium, and so on. So we're getting some kind of recognition. One of our books was mentioned in an article by Malis Reuven. It's written Ruthven, but it's actually pronounced Reuven in the New York Review of Books. So we've made a start, and I might mention that we had, for our first 3 conferences, we had financial help from Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins Foundation.
How are we doing?
We're running out.
Okay, I'll leave it to you. Okay, so we've made a start, and I think the Quranic criticism is one of the ways we can bring about an enlightenment.
So I'm going to start on a little more somber note. 2 days ago, a Somali girl of 10 died. She bled out in a hospital. Her mother had taken her for what is commonly referred to as female genital mutilation, which is removing parts of a woman's genitals due to religious reasons. In Somalia, that is about 98% of women go through that procedure. We don't know much about the case, considering it was the day before yesterday. But the most common type, which occurs among 80% of women in Somalia, involves removing the labia, removing the clitoris, sewing the vaginal opening shut, allowing a small opening for urine and blood. After that, their legs are tied together for 40 days, from the ankles to the hips, to allow the formation of scar tissue. Again, this is 80% of Somali women. Why would a mother do this? And overwhelmingly, mothers and grandmothers are involved in this. One of the reasons is acceptance within the community, acceptance within the society. If vast majorities of people are involved in it, then you have to do it to comply. The other part of it is finding a suitable marriage partner, and obviously complying with the wishes of God. If God has mandated and has asked that this be done, of course you will comply to the will of Allah. FGM is often contentious. It may have originated in an African tribal culture, but like with most things with religion co-opts local culture and customs and repackages them and resells them. Islam did the same with FGM. It repackaged it, it embraced it, and it sold it and spread it around the world. It went from, if it was an African tradition, to going from the Horn of Africa all the way to Indonesia and Malaysia, to the Pacific Rim, across the world. There is no consequence of the procedure in Somalia. If somebody is doing it, there is no legal sanction. They do not go to jail. They are not punished in any way, shape, or form, even though it is technically illegal. Why is that? Political parties, political groups are beholden to religious groups who believe that it is the right thing to do. So in a bid not to offend religious groups, they refuse to pass any criminal sanction against it. The same happens in Indonesia. In 2006, they made it illegal. The procedure was illegal. Within a few years, there was widespread resistance by the ulama, by the religious scholars, and the ban was repealed. We may think that this is in a faraway land, but this is happening in America as well. Recently, a woman was arrested, an Indian woman is arrested in Michigan for performing FGM on Somali girls. FGM exists in India as well. It's not as prevalent as Somalia, where it's 98%. It's a lower percentage, but it exists. In Islam, the hadiths, both for male circumcision and for female circumcision and FGM, the hadiths talk about it. They recommend it. Scholars talk about it. For men, it's universally mandated. For women, it depends upon which school of thought you're in. Certain schools of thought mandate it, certain recommend it. Wherever globally where we find that school of thought where it's mandated, you find extremely high prevalence. Indonesia, 90-something%. In Somalia, 98%. They follow the Shafi fiqh. So whenever there's a cause for reform, when people try to push back, usually it's religion that stands in the way that tries to prevent it. And it's not just FGM. FGM may be the most dire occurrence that we see, but across the board, in every single aspect, domestic violence is legal within Muslim countries. Most Muslim countries, it's legal to beat your wife. And that comes from the Quranic scripture that Ibn Warraq was mentioning. Quran 4:34 allows a husband to discipline his wife. So whenever there's opposition, when there's an attempt to change that law, religious groups stand up and stand in opposition saying, this is against the will of God. How dare you subvert the will of God? We see this in other instances as well. Slavery. Slavery was allowed in Islam when there was no anti-slavery movement, widespread anti-slavery movement in the Muslim world. It happened due to pressure from Western colonial powers. When Turkey banned slavery, there was open revolt in Saudi Arabia as a result of that. Saudi Arabia was never colonized by the West. As a result, slavery continued on there. It stopped in the 1960s, 50 years ago. There are living slaves in Saudi Arabia today. I know somebody who knew slaves growing up. It stopped in the 1960s due to American intervention. John F. Kennedy pushed the Saudi government to abolish slavery. So, as I was saying, whenever human rights campaigners work on these issues, when they try to push for change, when they try to change things around the edges, religious clerics stand up and accuse them of blasphemy, of heresy, of violating the laws of God. With apostasy in general, with blasphemy in general, people are risking their lives. When they're accused of that, there is a high probability they will be targeted for murder by mobs, by the government. Within Islam, persecution of dissent has existed from the very beginning. When Muhammad died, the first major war that happened is called the Apostasy War. People had left Islam, so there was a major war waged against those that had left. They were given the choice of convert or die, and tens of thousands of people did die in that war. Even today, in the modern era, we have about 13 countries where it is illegal to leave Islam. You will, not just illegal, you will be killed for leaving Islam. It's illegal in far more countries. Similarly with blasphemy, in many countries, blasphemy will get you a death sentence. This is in the 21st century. Beyond state persecution itself, we also have vigilantes. We have religious groups, religious scholars. Ali was mentioning Bangladeshi bloggers. Over the past few years, vigilantes attacked Bangladeshi bloggers, secular bloggers, for writing online, took meat cleavers and killed them. And Bangladesh isn't alone. This has happened across the Muslim world. In Pakistan, a teenager was accused of blasphemy, just accused, and he was lynched in his school. In Afghanistan, a woman was accused of either tearing or burning the Quran, and she was torn to pieces. The accusation was false. She was killed anyways. In Pakistan, a governor was murdered. The governor of the largest state in Pakistan was murdered. His crime, he talked about blasphemy, and he said that he didn't say blasphemy laws should be abolished. He said they should apply to Muslims. We're talking about Muslim beliefs. Why should Christians would suffer under this when they don't even believe in this religion? How is it blasphemy for them? He was murdered for that. Not only was he murdered, his murderer had mosques built in his honor.
Yeah, 1 million people at his funeral.
Yeah.
Statue.
In killer's honor.
Yeah, in the killer's honor, in the murderer's honor.
Right, he was his bodyguard, by the way.
Yeah. Even lawyers who have defended blasphemers, accused blasphemers, have been murdered. So they don't even want people defending them. So as a result of this sort of pressure, reform has taken a bit of a circular route instead of linear, where people try to push for reform. They want change to happen. They want civil liberties. They want human rights to be infused with Islam. They want to merge the two. They want Islam to be better. But when they do that, they themselves are accused of heresy. They themselves are accused of apostasy, and they suffer the exact same fate that actual apostates like us do. Beyond the modern era, Ahmadis 100 or so years ago, Baha'is 150 years ago, these are religious movements that were trying to reform Islam in various ways. They were targeted, they were persecuted, they're persecuted to this day. People that were trying modernism, scientists that were trying to change things, politicians, people that were involved in the state themselves, all of these have been persecuted, have been killed as a result of this over the past 2-3 centuries. Even today, those that are trying to reform, you guys may have heard of Majid Nawaz, of Irshad Manji. They're frequently labeled apostates with attempts to link them as us and push them into the same category where it is okay, not just okay, obligatory to kill them. The Urdu phrase is wajib al-qatl. It is required for Muslims to kill these people. So it may feel hopeless at this point. Like, the obstacles we encounter seem insurmountable, but I'm not here to talk about how hopeless everything is, a tale of woe, if you will. I'm here to tell you about how wonderful things can be and how there's a lot of hope even today. That may seem counterintuitive, but recently there was a Pew survey that came out that said that 23% of those that were raised Muslim in America have left the faith. 23%, 1 in 4. That is an insane number. I was blown away when I read that number. But as Ali was mentioning, it's not just America, 19% in Saudi Arabia. It's across the Muslim world. The same trends that are affecting the West, that are affecting Christians, for example, are affecting Muslims as well. They're leaving the faith in droves. So for us, for me, it was amazing. It was wonderful. For Muslims, obviously, it's a whole different ballgame. They're traumatized by this. They're shaken by this, Muslim leaders in particular. We've been doing this tour for about a year. A few months ago, we were in DC, and a lot of ex-Muslims are in the closet. And we heard from some of them that after our event in DC, an imam quit his day job, he quit being an imam, because he was so traumatized by our event in his city of DC that he wanted to dedicate his his life to countering us. That is how traumatized one event of us speaking was to him.
Creating opportunities.
Yeah. The rise of ex-Muslims is unprecedented. This has never happened before. Islam is a relatively young religion in the way it acts at the very least. It has the confidence of a young religion, the cockiness of a young religion. If you remember when you were teenagers, you believed you were invincible. Mortality did not occur to you. You would do whatever you wanted to do. You believed that there were no consequences to that. And Islam is sort of in the same zone where it believes that it's invulnerable. They've never had to wrestle with mass doubt. They've never had the sort of what Christianity had to go through over the past few centuries. Why is this happening now? Why is this possible now? Why did it not happen when Jewish and Christian communities were going through it over the past many, many centuries? One of the things that the nature of Islam is somewhat different. Islam is far more authoritarian. It's far more controlling. Reform, the word reform itself, innovation, is bid'ah. It's one of the worst things you can do. You cannot change Islam. Islam is viewed as the direct word of God, the literal word of God. It is viewed as describing reality itself. It is perfect. It talks. Whatever it says is actually true. This made it somewhat impervious to reform for people demanding change. On the other hand, this also makes it very vulnerable to a direct assault because they believe everything in it is true. When you point out flaws in it, it crumbles very, very rapidly. And we see that with ex-Muslims all the time. They find one flaw, they find one problem. They read about the fact that Muhammad had sex slaves. Sex slavery was common in that era and Muslims practiced it. They read about women's rights. They understand the context of what the Quran came. And as a result, within a few weeks, within a few months, people leave the religion entirely. Muslims themselves are still in denial of this brittle nature of Islam. And this makes it even more vulnerable because they can't counter us. They have this axiomatic belief that everything in Islam is perfect. So obviously whatever we're doing can't be real we can't really be denying anything in Islam because everything in Islam is perfect and true, and you can't really deny the truth. So it's very hard for them to actually counter us. They come up with arguments talking about our motivations, that we must have some dark motivations. But they can't actually counter our arguments because they don't believe our arguments can hold water because Islam is perfect. Another thing that happened was with the changes with the Enlightenment and the Reformation, whatever happened in the West, it happened over centuries using the printed word. The printed word was everywhere and it changed things dramatically. Martin Luther's Reformation could not have happened without the printed word. In the Muslim world, that wasn't the case. In the West, we had 6 centuries of that. In the Muslim world, for a majority of that time, printing presses were outright banned. The Ottoman Empire banned it, the Safavid Empire banned it, the Mughals banned it. So they were able to exert control over the people in a way that they couldn't in the West. The internet is doing that now. With the internet is acting as a printing press. It's providing information to people in Muslim communities everywhere around the world. This is why we're seeing this bubble up every single place. And today Muslims may not understand it, may not be able to counter it, but that won't last. We have a small window of opportunity over here. Muslim governments are already starting to try to stem the tide. Within Pakistan, for example, and not just Pakistan, many other Muslim countries, Facebook has been banned, YouTube has been banned. They've started to make agreements with the providers to ban certain aspects of it. They monitor it and they report it. Same with Twitter. Day before yesterday, the Islamabad High Court in Pakistan demanded that Twitter be banned. So in Turkey, Wikipedia was banned. So they're starting to push back. The thing is, a lot of Muslim countries don't have the resources of somebody like China, for example, where they have the Great Firewall of China, where they block everything. But that's a matter of time. They're becoming richer. The resources are improving, and they will do that. Which is why we must act now. We don't have forever to dwell on this and slowly but surely hope that things will change. Our choices are consequential about where we go from here. For the first time in our lives, and probably the first time in history, we have a chance to deal a body blow to Islam. And there's no reason we shouldn't do that. For a long time, we've been talking about in our communities, about half measures, about slight reform. There's no reason to do that today. We're hoping for a more convenient moment where the political climate will be better. The political climate does not matter, and that's a short-term thing. 5 years ago versus today, the political climate has gotten worse, not better. We need to commit our efforts, our total efforts, to the end of Islam. It is causing undue suffering on a fourth of humanity. In what moral and ethical framework is it okay to allow that to happen? We can convince these people. These people are our families, our parents, our children, our brothers and sisters, our friends. If we can be convinced, they're no different than us. It's a matter of having those conversations, pushing that change to happen, and it does happen. We see that with ex-Muslims again and again. One person leaves, and like dominoes, the entire family leaves the religion. I know this is somewhat extraordinary, suggesting that Islam itself needs to be a relic of history. But we live in extraordinary times. It is our duty to do this. Thank you very much. So we're going to have a question and answer session. If you guys can line up on the side over there. One question each. If you have multiple questions, you'll have to go back to the end of the line, and you can ask as many questions as you want, as long as you go around every time you have another question.
So my question specifically for the ex-Muslims of North America as an organization, considering recently that the Council of British Ex-Muslims went to the Pride Parade this year, in spite of everything that happened to them in the previous year from the East London Mosque, is your organization planning on participating in the 50th annual New York City Pride Parade in order to do that?
Not at the moment. We haven't thought about it, but I'd be happy to work with you if you can grab our brochure and get in touch with me. We haven't done that sort of activism yet, but I don't see any reason why we can't.
I also want to add to that, if you're, if you're in New York, and this is something that I want to do, you don't have to necessarily have the organization to do it. Get a bunch of friends together and take out the signs. I mean, I think Mariam had signs like the Allah is gay signs.
Yeah.
Do whatever you want. Go out there and just make your presence known. I mean, this is something that you can just do right at a grassroots level, just on your own.
So ultimately, all of these changes that have happened, Ibn Warraq decided to write a book, and that book influenced other people. Ali decided to write a book on his own. I decided to start this organization. All of you guys can do work on your own, start new things, new initiatives. If you want to participate in the Great Pride Parade, you can create an ex-Muslim organization specifically about that. Why not? It's a matter of putting in the time and effort to make that happen. There are millions of us out there. If the 23% Pew poll is accurate, we have probably about 1 million ex-Muslims in America. They should organize better. There are other aspects in which they could organize, and everybody should be working to make that happen.
So, all three of you were talking about the Enlightenment as an encouragement for leaving Islam. I was wondering if perhaps there might be also another way of encouraging people. For example, and you're using the Sam Harris way. What about Jordan Peterson way of having a personal reasons to do it, to try to stop malevolence, for in that kind of aspect where it's more on the personal as than the Enlightenment, because Enlightenment you could choose it or not choose it, as opposed to if it's personal, if it's relevant, then it's something that it's a new perspective, it's a new.
So, for a lot of people, there's a different reason for every single person, I would say. For certain people, it is Enlightenment values that pull them off. For certain people, it's personal issues. Certain people that are, say, are gay, they encounter the issues and they understand and they look into the scriptures and they realize that this is wrong and immoral and they leave because of that. So there's a huge, huge variety of reasons why people leave. We're not advocating for one specific way of going about it. For everybody, there's a different way, and we should be targeting all of those, and we do. We have a YouTube series, if you go to YouTube and look up ex-Muslims in North America, called Life Beyond Faith, where we've profiled a good amount of ex-Muslims, including multiple gay people, including people from most parts of the world, from Somalia, from Kurdistan, from Arabia, from Egypt, and all of them have their own perspectives. It's different for every single person. One of the guys that I believe is from Pakistan, he talked about how astronomy helped him out of religion. He looked at the skies, he was entranced by it, he studied physics, and he's an astrophysicist now, and he left religion as a result of that.
I see. Second question: How do I?
Second question.
How do I convince? How do I convince? I was trying to convince a girl to come over here. How do I do that?
We'll answer that later. So one question per person.
But can I add? Can I just add something to the answer to your question? Because you mentioned the Jordan Peterson thing. So, that's fine. The Enlightenment. First of all, the Enlightenment values are actually personal. So when you talk about civil rights, everybody being able to say whatever they want, many of the people who are feeling constrained by it, right? These are people who, we recently, there was this young woman from Iraq who just came here. She's an ex-Muslim. I forgot, her name is Lubna, I think? Yeah. So her main thing was when she was in Iraq, she was just asking people, it's like, why are there two standards for men and women? Why do I have to wear the hijab and the guy doesn't have to do anything? A simple question like that got her beaten and thrown out of class. Okay, so they ask simple questions, and this thing about being able to express yourself and be yourself, that's at the heart of what Enlightenment values are. So I reject the notion that the Enlightenment values are just a societal thing. They're actually very, very personal as well. The other problem is with Jordan Peterson, even though I do agree with him on everything he says about compelled speech. One of the problems is his religious rhetoric when he talks about Christianity. This, I think, is a problem. To a lot of people, it works. As Muhammad's saying, it does appeal to people. But to me, the most dangerous thing about Islam isn't just the terrorism and the jihadism. I think these are fleeting things. They're sort of like the twigs on the tree. But the most dangerous thing about it, I think, is the one thing that it shares with many other religions, and that's the idea of faith. Faith means to believe things without evidence. I don't have faith that the chair I'm sitting on exists. I have knowledge. I know that it does. Faith, by definition, means that I reject all the evidence in front of me and I take that leap, the leap of faith, to believe something that is just pure hearsay, right? Which is, and that is always a bad process to get to a conclusion. Even if you could sometimes get to the right conclusion, right? You could get to the right conclusion. There are good things in the Bible. There are good things in the Quran.
I guess we'll have to wait and see with the debate and the video and audio of the debate between Peterson and Harris.
Yeah. So
pass the mic on.
We'll do. Yeah, time. If you can go ahead. But I think that that's one of the problems I have with that. I think that if you keep the faith part intact and just get rid of the twigs, the root problem is still there.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so my question is, how reliable are the polls? When you cite polls, I get encouraged, but I'm kind of pessimistic kind of guy because I'm a little bit older guy and I have not seen a lot of people growing up. In fact, if anything that I've seen is people are going worse, people were very, like open-minded and they just started getting into religion more and more. So my experience personal, has been that, 1 in 5 sometimes. Sometimes I hear 1 in 5, sometimes 1 in 4, 23% you cited, for the Americans, but I don't see it. I see a lot of people getting even more into religion.
Sure.
So
to give you a few anecdotes regarding that.
Sure.
The issue is ex-Muslims are so heavily stigmatized that they're not willing to speak up. Within the families they exist, they don't speak up. One of the guys I know, he left the religion, didn't tell his family. He was in college. He came home one night during the summer break and he was drunk. And his family noticed there was a huge fight. He, at that point, admitted that he was an atheist. And why would he not drink? He doesn't even believe in Islam. He was thrown out of the house. That was that. The next day he met with his dad, and his dad said, I've been an atheist for 30 years. I never told anybody. Why did you?
Here we go.
Yeah.
Next.
And
Hello.
I'll also just say to that.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'll also. Oh,
No,
sorry.
go ahead.
Yeah, I'll also say to that the question. I get the pessimism. You always want to expect the worst, but if you, again, as I said, if you look at the reactions of the way that people are reacting to this, you scream the loudest when you're about to die. When you're in the throes of death, you scream the loudest, right? If you know that someone is leaving, you're going to try to hold on to them the most and you'll scream. The people who don't care are just going to be sitting there quietly. So what you hear and what's actually happening are two different things. A lot of what we see, I see the rise, you can look at it as the rise of Trumpism and the rise of the far right populism. A lot of this is actually a backlash to a world that is becoming more progressive. A lot of Islamic people getting even more fundamentalist are a backlash. Saudi Arabia cracking down on atheists, Malaysia cracking down on atheists, Egypt jailing atheists, all of this stuff that's happening. The reason that this is so recent is because there are a lot of atheists that they need to react to. If that cause wasn't there, that effect wouldn't happen. So we have to look at it that way. The final thing I'll say on this is that I would say read Steven Pinker's new book, Enlightenment Now. He has a section on it called on Muslim humanism in that, where he's actually mentioned all three of us in that book. And he has he talks about the basic ideas looking at trend lines and headlines. So when you look at headlines every day, you're going to have a heart attack, right? I would completely agree with you on your pessimism. But when you look at trend lines over time, it's a completely different story. And we have been getting better in all ways. And there's no reason that this shouldn't either.
For what it's worth, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, could you have imagined being at an event of ex-Muslims in New York?
That's
Yeah.
I'm here. That's why
Yeah.
I've been saying a lot of things, but first time I'm hearing those things.
Yeah, and I'm really sorry. I got to add something else to that. The Salman Rushdie affair that you were talking about, that was less than 30 years ago. Almost, I think it was 29 years ago or so.
And with Christianity, the changes took 500 or so years.
Yeah. So it was less than 30 years ago that Salman Rushdie had to go underground. He had to go into hiding. I remember the first time I saw the Danish cartoon, the prophet, they had the Muhammad with the bomb in his head, and I was looking at it and I was shocked because even though I was an atheist and I thought it was funny, I had never seen anything like that in public. I mean, you've seen images of Muhammad in old history books, but nothing that mainstream. Now you go online, there's millions of images everywhere. I mean, this tour, these books, these podcasts, if you just look at this in the last 30 years, considering that Salman Rushdie had to go into hiding 30 years ago, right, that then there is reason for it. It doesn't mean that, everything Muhammad talked about is absolutely true. There's a lot of really real risks and a lot of work to be done, but there is also reason for optimism. There's a reason to start planning for what we're going to go, or where we're going to go next.
Hello. I've kind of noticed a phenomenon of people who identify as maybe Muslim, maybe Christian, maybe Jewish, but often Muslim, who identify as liberals, but present as religious or culturally Muslim. And I'm trying to figure out a way that you guys were able to go from maybe identifying with the culture and then going to a religious to just flat out, I'm a liberal, I'm a non-religious person, because a lot of the Muslim acquaintances and friends I have are go to LGBTQ marches, are good liberals, if you want to say that, but still get maybe sensitive or concerned about some of the other issues related to Islam. So I'm wondering if how that leap is going to be possible, specifically in the Muslim community.
So my perspective is they've never been challenged. So it's easy to be comfortable and say that my religion, my background is wonderful. With Christianity, people have been challenged, so they're forced to acknowledge the horrors of their past. With the Muslim world, that hasn't happened. I was mentioning slavery. The Arab slave trade was larger, more extensive, more brutal than the Atlantic slave trade. We never talk about it. That's why they're comfortable enough to have those identities, because they've never been challenged.
And I think that there are other personal aspects to it too, and I wrote about this in my book as well. That I found I'm actually very privileged, because I had a family where, even though my parents were sort of liberally religious, they didn't force me to fast during Ramadan, right? So when we had Ramadan, when we had our iftar party thing, like iftar is the breaking of the fast, I like that, and I still like that. My family still celebrate. I'm there. The food is amazing. If there's food or a party, I'm there. I don't care. But I know that there are many other people who come from very conservative backgrounds, and whose families forced them to. They starved their kids, right? They compelled them to do it, and they didn't even allow them to drink water, and they don't have the same association that I do, right? So it's. I think it's different for different people. Phil Zuckerman, he's a great scholar. I think that everybody should read his books as well. He talks about secularizing religion. He talks about different kinds of apostasy. So he talks about mild apostasy, which is what I'm saying, right? Reject the religion. And he talks about transformative apostasy, which is something like what Ayaan Hirsi Ali did, where she was so oppressed by the religious aspects. I mean, she underwent FGM as well, that she completely does not want anything to do with it. Right, so I think that people come to it from different ways. There's religious remnants that are going to stay, like, Thursday is actually Thursday. Goodbye was short for God be with you. I mean, these are elements that are going to stay. I like Christmas as well. I enjoy some of the holidays and some of the rituals. These things happen. Different people take it different way, but there are associations that we have as children, and if you are from a place where you have positive associations with that, I think it's okay to welcome those people in as well, and just talk about and it's a great way to distinguish between Islam, the ideology, and Muslim, the identity. Yeah.
We have to do this a little quickly. We're running out of time. So
yeah.
All right. So my second question is not for myself, but for my friend. I'm actually from Pakistan and from Lahore. And I've had different questions asking about considering the new policies by these far-right governments, what does an organization like the Ex-Muslims North America do about asylum seekers for LGBT women or atheists? Or is there any sort of incentives, or has there been any sort of change or any help towards that?
So we've had a few meetings with the State Department where we're pushing for freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and for apostate rights. But we're a relatively young organization. We've been around less than 5 years. So we don't have that pull yet. But we ultimately want to get to that stage where the American government recognizes the problem in Muslim countries and gives special status to those that are dissenting. Whenever somebody speaks out, they get attacked. I know many, many ex-Muslims in Pakistan that have been arrested, that have been jailed, that have had to run away. And there needs to be some sort of international effort to protect them. We do what we can to a certain extent, but we don't have those resources yet. Hopefully down the road, as we grow larger, we'll be able to do more.
And this is actually a really quick thing to add to that. There is the Center for Inquiry has a program called Secular Rescue, and they have done a lot. Unfortunately they can't speak about all of the people they've helped, but they've helped 40 plus people and more coming out of mainly Muslim majority countries who come here, including Pakistan, including Egypt, including I think Morocco, and the most prominent case was Iraq, Lebanon. So that's something you can, if you want to Google Secular Rescue, if you know anybody who needs help with that, who's being in fear of persecution or death, these countries, that they have a lot of resources right now, and they are growing as well.
First of all, thank you all three of you for being here and doing what you do, you godly unwiggish lot, spreading the germ of free thought and decadence far and broad. I just have a quick question for Mr. Warraq. Maybe you could say a word or two about the pernicious influence that Edward Said and his atheistical intelligentsia class of people in the new churches, the institutions of higher learning in this country and abroad, have had on how do you put it? The tamping down on religious criticism, especially in the so-called third world, Islam in general. In my own experience, it's been pretty horrendous. I, as a scholar, have come up against many walls, and all of it born out of a school of thought, post-colonial studies, et cetera, that posits that just because if a thing belongs to someone else, you can't fully know it, you can't fully study it unless you belong to that tradition. So I'm just wondering, I know you've written a lot about this, but I'd like to hear it in person because I'm a huge fan. I love the way you talk.
I wrote a whole book, I think it's my masterpiece actually, on Edward Said and his pernicious influence. It's called Defending the West, a critique of Edward Said's Orientalism. He intimidated Western intellectuals since his book was published. I think it was in 75, 78, I forget the exact date. His book Orientalism really shut down all debate. So you were not allowed to criticize anything in the Islamic world because it was the equivalent of Islamophobia now. You were called an Orientalist. But his arguments were so poor. I mean, I go through his arguments one by one. For example, he says that all the scholars of Islam in the West, Islamologists, were in cahoots with the imperial powers, and they were just using their knowledge to help the imperial ambitions of the Western powers, which is complete and utter nonsense, because the greatest Islamologists starting in the 19th century were Germans, and Germans did not have any colonies in the Islamic world to start with. You can't imagine doing Islamic studies without coming across the works of Theodor Noldecker, Hungarian. There was a Hungarian scholar called Ignaz Goldziher, August Fischer, Karl Brockelmann. It's just one after another. It's a complete absurd argument. The other thing he talks about is he says they don't. These scholars don't in fact arrive at the truth. It's what the so-called knowledge that they have concocted is all wrong. But it makes no sense to say that. How can this wrong knowledge help to subjugate the so-called the colonial people? It goes on. And then, of course, for him, there's no such thing as the truth. He's a complete relativist. Although he himself wants to say that his argument is true, again, it backfires on him. Scholars have been reluctant. They're terrified of being called Orientalist. I've met them, and they trying to do research, trying to do just ordinary objective research, and you're suddenly faced with this Orientalist label that's stuck on you. And incidentally, Said he didn't know Arabic that well. He really didn't. He taught himself a little bit of classical Arabic late in life, but he knew nothing about Islamic studies. He was incapable of talking about the contributions of these great, and they were not anti-Islam either. Most of them, in fact, were dogmatically Islamophiles. People like William Montgomery Watt, who was my professor at Edinburgh University, incidentally. I take him to task for being far too uncritical of the sources, and they inadvertently, both he and Edward Said encouraged the fundamentalists. And Said at least admitted that on one occasion. I was rather staggered. But he had this enormous influence. I think young people who go to universities in the United States, in many cases, the first book they're asked to read is Orientalism. This is extraordinary. I mean, and I gave a talk about my book at the, if anybody's here from Columbia University, at the bookshop, which go down right next to the entrance at Columbia University. And I came in on the day I was giving the talk, and first thing that hit me was this is just beginning of the academic year. This enormous, at least 100 copies of Edward Said's Orientalism, and no copies of my book. Although so that's
Thank you.
okay.
Thank you very much for being here. In my experience, when you begin to criticize the Islamic world on basis of, they don't respect individual rights, no free inquiry, and very poor, not very economic developments, other than like the really rich Gulf oil states, people bring up the Islamic Golden Age, and as an example of, well, look how great Islam was, look how great it is. But when you look at it, you see that the large factor in promoting the sciences and free inquiry at that time was classical Greek reason, specifically Aristotle. I'm wondering, why do you think that did not live on? If you lived in the 900 AD and you were to bet which was to become the metropolitan, scientifically literate part of the world, you would have bet it was the Islamic world and not the Christian West in Charlemagne's time. Why do you think it did not go through, and what do you think we could do now to leverage that history to introduce an Islamic world that is more intellectually diverse and much more affected by classical Greek reason than the one we have today?
Yeah, why it did not go on. That's a good question, and that's something that I don't think I know enough to answer that in detail. I think that there were probably a lot of factors, but one thing I'll say about the Islamic Golden Age, so-called, is that the people say it happened because of Islam, as if Islam should take the credit. It actually happened despite Islam, and this is something that it works in other areas too. I mean, it's like saying that Isaac Newton, giving credit to Isaac Newton for all of his discoveries, giving that credit to Christianity because he was Christian. Or giving Einstein's discoveries, that was Jewish, or because people get a lot of scientific Nobel Prizes go to Jewish people, that's because it's the Jewish Golden Age. Nobody says that, and the reason nobody says that because it has nothing to do with Judaism, right? In the same way, this Golden Age had nothing to do with Islam. From the bit that I've read, or what I do know about it, is that a lot of the reason that this was clamped down in the Islamic world is every time there was somebody who was a heretic, which is a synonym for reformer, by the way. Anytime there was somebody like that, they were quickly shut down. What Muhammad was talking about in terms of what happens to blasphemers, this is something that happened with free thinkers in the Islamic world. So they had to stay within the confines of what they were allowed to say. And this isn't just a matter, this isn't just something that happened in the Muslim world. The guy who discovered oxygen was actually burned to death, which requires oxygen, ironically. And then there was, we know the story of Galileo, we know the story of, Darwin, a lot of that, it's still very, very controversial today, and people still have a problem with it. So anytime someone comes up with discoveries and tries to venture out beyond what those confines are, if those confines are really deeply societally ingrained, like it is the case in the Muslim world, where even the most secular states aren't really truly secular, there's still some sort of religious influence in the government, then that makes the situation even more dire. I mean, if you're Pervez Hoodboy, who's a Pakistani professor, physics professor, he's actually written about this quite a bit, and the way I interpret what he says is that I just think that if you're born with a book and the book has all the answers that you need, what are you going to be curious about? If you're given everything that you need, if the answer to everything you need is, this scholar, this book, or this hadith, that's if you're, instead of making a decision, well, should I start smoking or not? Instead of thinking about, is this the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do? If you say, well, what do the ulama say about smoking? Is it haram or is it halal? If that's the way that you're going to think, which is the way that a lot of people do think there, you're not going to get very far in terms of science, because science is based on curiosity. So although I don't know what the exact circumstances were historically for that dying out there, a lot of it had to do with the printing press, as you said, that they banned it, apart from the oppression by the people. I do think that a lot of those factors are still the same factors that would stop it if it happened today.
So, historically, the 12th century, what happened was the people that were admired in the West, Averroes and Avicenna and Al-Farabi, were in fact attacked particularly by Al-Ghazali. Very easy date to remember. He died in 1111. He had this enormous influence he attacked all the philosophers who were influenced by Greek philosophy particularly. And as Heinrich Heine once said, once you bring in philosophy into religion, you're sunk. And this was Ghazali's. He said that if you follow to the arguments of the philosophers to their logical conclusion, you end up in atheism. Therefore, it must be countered. And then there was this division between the Islamic sciences and the non-Islamic sciences. So there was even attempts to Islamize biology in the 19th century. They had this. They had to see everything through the Islamic lens, and the whole idea that all of knowledge is in the Quran, as you said, is not exactly conducive to intellectual inquiry or curiosity.
I had one thing that I don't believe that an Islamic Golden Age even existed, in the sense that it's something that we look back at romantically and try to create this narrative. Back in the day, a lot of these people were heretics, they were persecuted. Al-Razi's books don't exist today. Why do they not exist? They were burned, they were destroyed. So it's easy historically go back 1,000 years, find 5 people that did great work and make it into this broad movement, which I don't think was the case. In Spain, which is regarded as wonderful and enlightened, a library was built by a caliph. The next caliph came in and said it was heresy and burned the library down. So sort of things like this, it was more the whims of the ruler. You had a ruler that was pro-science or pro-free thought, and you had a period of free thought blossoming. The next ruler came up and tore it all down. So it wasn't a sustained period. We're running out of time, so quick questions. We're almost through, so let's keep the responses short too.
Yeah.
Hello, gentlemen. Thank you for coming. It seems that in the West, every Western nation will claim that free speech is one of its anchors of its existence. Now, I've seen in the past couple of years that in America, that's enshrined into law, but in other Western countries, it is not. And in the last few years, those seem to have been swept away with great rapidity in Canada and in Britain and in Germany. Do you think the work that you men are doing would be possible in those countries or in certain cities in those countries? Could you do this in, say, Berkeley, California, in Birmingham, England?
We couldn't do this here a few years ago. We are doing it now. So even if we can't do it over there, I don't see why we can't do it tomorrow or the day after. My goal isn't just to change things here. We want to change the entire world, and we will.
Yes. But do you see how quickly Britain and Germany and Sweden have censored and self-censored themselves so much on social media? Theresa May's Britain and the London police force.
So I think there's a
goes after people
when you
on
talk
Twitter.
about free speech, there's a free speech culture, and then there's free speech legally.
Yes.
Now, in a lot of European countries, as you say, you're right. Like Holocaust denial is illegal in a lot of countries in Europe, which I don't agree with at all.
Which we need to work to change.
Yeah.
They need more free speech than they have right now.
Yeah, they do. And there are, there are people who are banned from entering and speaking in the UK because they say things that people don't like, and I disagree with a lot of those people. But I think I think everybody should be able to speak. I'm happy to have Islamists and jihadists come and speak at American universities. I want that. I want those ideas to be exposed. I think that one of the great things about Trump, and I'm no fan of Trump, but one of the great things that he's done is he's brought a lot of this stuff to the surface, and people are speaking about it. And even if it's being exposed, then it's going to be countered. Otherwise, you drive it underground, and it festers. And when it festers, it comes back more aggressive and more violent than ever before. So I completely agree with you. I think that should happen. As Muhammad said, I think that it goes through phases where that's going to happen. But I don't think that European countries or even Canada, to some extent, doesn't get, and I'm Canadian, but they don't understand free speech the way that the U.S. does. But the culture that you're talking about, as far as the universities go, that's a more controversial thing. Deplatforming, if a university decides to do that, there's no legal. I mean, it's not an issue where the government is saying, well, you can't speak or you can't hold this event here. It sucks. It's terrible because I know that XMNA had to ran into this whole thing. We were going to have an event in Toronto, and that was one of them that canceled. Yeah, they cancel. Universities cancel events, but the government isn't telling us that we can't do it. So that's it. I think that's a difference.
So that's a cultural change that we need to push, where people understand that it's important to even hear things we consider horrible. We need to talk about those issues. That's how things change. What earlier said about Islamists coming to campus, that's a good thing. When they come to campus, you can talk to them, you can challenge them, and you can expose how horrible their ideas are. If you don't have that conversation, things can't change.
Hi, I have a question regarding, I believe you said a professor lost his job because of Saudi funders didn't, like what he was doing. So I was wondering if, how in the U.S. specifically do you hold institutions and grant makers accountable when they enable atrocities and crimes to continue, specifically entities who claim to be liberal and guided by Enlightenment principles and for social justice and civil rights and so forth, but they won't support you because they're afraid of whoever may be funding them or the status quo. How do you respond to that?
So my perspective is, yes, that happens, but it's our duty to change those perspectives. Change doesn't happen naturally. Change doesn't happen easily. People that gain power don't give it up easily. There are millions of ex-Muslims. There are millions of true liberals that want liberal values. They need to start pushing back and standing up, and within their institutions, within their schools, within their environments, change things. Nothing will happen overnight. We complain about something that this is wrong isn't enough. We need to take action. We need to push forth. And if you're working in one of those institutions, you can raise hell within that institution. You can raise hell with the media about why this is happening. And when enough people around the country start doing that, they will have no choice but to pull back from their attitudes.
Mm-hmm. And I think it is sort of, I'm seeing the beginnings of it happen. I know that there are high-profile people like Bill Maher. He's doing it. I know that Sam Harris is having Pangborn Philosophy is doing all these events where they have these the conversations happening at a very large scale, and many of the people who go to them are liberal people, liberal line, and they want to change things, and I think it's already happening to some extent.
My question is specifically in your case as a nonprofit applying for grants and getting denied by them. How do you respond? What is your response to that as a nonprofit? At that point, we can't do anything about the specific
grant. What we're trying to do is changing the culture entirely. Yeah. So get to a point where ex-Muslims are public enough that people understand that this is a debate happening within Muslim communities. It's conservative versus liberal, and they can choose to side with the conservative. That's their prerogative, but they need to understand that that is what they're doing. They're siding with the far right of our countries and our communities. Good for them if they want that. That's a horrible position to take, and we need to just point that out.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I heard you say, Muhammad, that your project, as you conceive it, with your organization, is to deal a body blow to Islam, and it's a very ambitious, but I would say laudable goal. And when you said that, I was thinking, when in history has such an ambitious project been undertaken? And actually, there have been examples. The most recent example that came to mind was the ex-communist movement and the Cold War, which was very tragic and long and everything. But but I was thinking to myself, there's a whole generation of ex-communists who lived through the Cold War, who have all this knowledge about how, like, from the, when their organizations were very small and grassroots. Secular Jihadist reminds me of Radio Free Europe in some ways. And and so I was thinking there is precedent for this, as ambitious as it is. So my question is, if you look at Eastern Europe now, there's been various degrees of success, like with the post-communist phase of the plan, and places like Hungary and Poland aren't exactly very democratic right now, and Putinism in Russia. And so my thought was, maybe, first of all, have you been in contact with, whoever those old ex-communists are, who maybe started Radio Free Europe back in the day? Do they have any words of wisdom to
Yeah, I'm actually working on a book on this whole issue of applying the lessons we learned from the Cold War. After all, we won the Cold War, and I am indeed in touch with some of these. There's somebody called Robert Riley, who's the head of the organization where I'm a fellow, the Westminster Institute. He worked for the Voice of America during the Reagan years, and we're trying to put together sort of lessons that we can learn from their experience. They had a series of publications that I think they were responsible for, if you include all the pamphlets as well, over 1 million publications. I mean, it's often not simply works of out-and-out propaganda, but works of literature, like they had the Great Gatsby was translated, and John Steinbeck, and then when Boris Pasternak's book Dr. Zhivago was translated, published, they were giving it, the CIA were giving it out to wherever they went. They were giving out people, giving these books out. So I'm actually completely aware. I've been reading a lot on this, like John Lewis Gaddis and various other scholars of the Cold War. So yes, it's a good.
We have 4 minutes left, so let's go through this very quickly.
Yes, it's a bit of a broad question, but what do you think was the impact of the Arab Spring on the state of secularism in the Muslim world? How did it affect the climate of opinion, and how does it affect your work today?
I'm going to try to keep this short. I think the Arab Spring was a very good thing. I think it shows the power of what you were saying about the internet, how the internet is doing the job that the printing press did for the Western, for Christians in the past. I think the internet is doing this for Islam, even though it wasn't completely Islam-centric. What they did was they brought down the Tahrir Square protests were organized on Facebook. Okay, so they brought down dictators that have been in power for decades. I mean, people in Libya, Gaddafi. I was in Libya. I grew up as a kid partly in Libya, and Gaddafi. 70% of the population is under the age of 30. Right? And they had not known anything apart from Gaddafi in Libya. Same thing with Mubarak in Egypt. So it was a very monumental thing. The only problem, the downside of that, is that many of the Middle Eastern dictators have, and this is an interesting thing about secularism, because here we associate secularism with freedom and enlightenment, whereas over there, many of their secularism has been forced on them many times. There are many secular dictatorships. So Mubarak is an example, Assad is another example. You had Kemal Ataturk in Turkey, who followed the Ottoman Empire, which was the last great Islamic caliphate, and so on. So you've had this, the only opposition that has been able to build in an organized way against these secular dictatorships has been Islamic organizations, right? So you saw when the Shah of Iran came down, you had this Islamic Shia theocracy that showed up. When you had when Mubarak came down, you had the Muslim Brotherhood that was elected, because these Muslim organizations, it's not that necessarily that all of these people are super religious. It's that they go out and, like what Hamas does, is they go out and they provide hospital services, they provide social services. They're actually less corrupt than many of the secular dictators. So it's a very, very complicated thing. But overall, the dynamic there is that when you do have these dictatorships fall, you have to leave some leeway for the fact that these Islamist organizations that have been organizing for decades will likely have a phase, and that will be one of the phases to moving beyond that into a sort of secular Enlightenment phase. And we're kind of seeing that in Iran now, that, Iran, the clerical establishment, there are a lot of cracks in it, and, they're kind of ahead of the curve on this, but the Iranian population, the people in Iran are widely known to be very, very
so we're
secular.
out of time, so I'll get all three of your questions in one shot, and then we'll answer all three.
Yeah, let's do that.
Say,
Sorry.
just a quick practical sense. When you're talking to your family, how do you address this question when they say, "Oh, since you don't speak Arabic and the classical Arabic, you are not qualified to talk about these things"? And how do you answer to that critic? Like, because if you cite something, the common answer is, well, you don't speak classical Arabic and you don't know enough about it as the classical scholars do. So how do you talk about that?
So I believe ex-Muslims are attacked from both sides, Muslims and Islamophobics, right? So my question is, how do you think we could achieve our goal without serving Islamophobics toward their hatred against Muslims?
Just one last one from Mr. Warraq. Virgins or raisins? What are your thoughts?
Why don't we start with that?
Virgins or rape?
Raisins.
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 Christoph Luxemburg.
Right. Yeah, that's very quickly. I don't know how I can do it very quickly. There's a scholar based in Germany, Christoph Luxemburg, who has, I think, Islamologists don't like to admit it, but he has shaken up Islamic studies by showing that one scholar said that 20% of the Quran makes no sense. And one of the reasons it doesn't make any sense is that, according to Luxemburg, what we have thought were Arabic words were in fact badly translated words from Syriac, which is a dialect, if you like, of Aramaic. And he gives examples of how certain passages which have made no sense up to now and scholars have not understood, and they have he has shown that by translating a word back into the Syriac and then seeing what the Syriac means, you will see that often one or the second meaning of the word fits better in the context than what was taken in the first instance. I usually give the example of when I was teaching at the University of Toulouse, they had to write essays in English for the first time, and one of the sentences was, I was teaching American civilization. The one sentence was, Americans are a litigious people, they're always consulting their avocados. So you can see, if you know a little bit of Spanish, you will see what's happened. He went to the dictionary, he looked up, in his head he had the French word avocat, he looked it up, and he looked, first word avocado, so he puts that, instead of, he got the wrong word. This is something similar. Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, we're out of time for the other questions. We're going to be outside for a little bit. There are drinks available outside, so you can answer those questions in person outside. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, everybody.